G'day everyone, we are at another Friday and it is another week of interesting events. In fact, a couple of really interesting things this week related to the cyber things, which I'm going to talk about shortly. If you're watching the video, you'll also see that I'm in full Pluralsight regalia, hat and t-shirt, because I've got another new Pluralsight course out this week. And also I didn't really feel like doing my hair and I've been in the pool. So that aside, let's jump into it and then I'll get to those other things a little bit later. So this week I did a talk at Techpalooza yesterday, and Techpalooza is an education-based conference, so it's a conference orientated at teachers, run by my sister-in-law, which is a nice kind of family tie there. So she had, I don't know, a couple of hundred people, something like that, at the school, which I did the talk at yesterday. It's school holidays here at the moment, so they basically just turned it into like a teacher carnival thing. And I'm mentioning it because it was kind of interesting to do a talk to non-cyber, non-technical people. And in fairness, these were people that probably have a greater appreciation for the role technology plays than most. But at the end of the day, they're teachers and they teach all sorts of different things. So it was kind of interesting to do a talk to those folks and explain some of the things we're sort of dealing with in the industry. And of course, one of the big things I spoke about was passwords. You know, look, we're kind of crap at passwords. And I spoke a lot about how our attitudes towards passwords are changing. So for example, the sort of premise of, you know, you got to have password complexity, you know, that sort of stuff's going out the windows in terms of you need to have uppercase and lowercase and all this kind of rubbish. We talked more about things like passphrases and of course, password managers and generated strings. Talk more about those a little bit later too. I had also a really interesting question from someone at the end of it, and I forget exactly how they worded it, but it was along the lines of, you know, what should kids be doing online now? So what sort of profile should they be creating for themselves? And I think it was sort of an acknowledgement that kids are going to be online in one form or another. And it was like, how do we actually create constructive productive environments for them? And when I answered the question, I said, look, I'll give you a really good example of what I think is a good positive role model, if you like, or certainly a good positive representation of what I think kids should be doing online. A friend of mine, Adam Kogan, some of you will know Adam, he's a very prominent guy in the Microsoft circles. He has two daughters who have been online for many, many years writing blogs. And they're teenagers, they're still at school, and they have these blogs, and you read the blog and you're like, these are really impressive kids, you know? So their image, their online identity is very centered around these images that they've created for themselves. And they're not fabricated either. I don't want to say created as in, you know, I've tried to put myself on this pedestal sort of thing. It is just genuine, heartfelt writing, which is really, really interesting. And if anyone comes along later on and looks at what Ruby and Eve have been writing, and I'm going to link to their blogs actually in the references section of this update. If anyone comes along and looks at this later on, they're going to look at it and go, wow, these girls are just super smart, super intelligent. So I reckon that's super cool. I know that there'll be plenty of people who argue with this because they go, kids should be kicking the footy or something, or, you know, not online. And there's a whole other discussion to be had there, which I'd like to actually have later this year because I'm getting my son, who's 8 at the moment, much more involved with this sort of thing too. But I'll link to Ruby and Eve's blogs, and I really suggest that if you're thinking about what would I like my children to look like online, I just think this is a really good example. So that was Techpalooza. That went very, very nicely yesterday. That was a very close event. I had to drive 10 minutes to get to that. Next week, I will be at events on the other side of the world. So I'm going back to Texas on Thursday next week, and I will be talking at Texas Cyber Summit in San Antonio on Friday next week. And I'll also be speaking at DevFest weekend in Dallas the day after, on the Saturday. And because, if I'm honest, I'm just getting a bit over the whole travel thing and it just being non-stop back-to-back sort of stuff, I'm taking my wife with me and then we're having a holiday. So that will be very nice. You might see some photos of hopefully very Texas-y things. I'm picturing like big steaks or something like that. So we will be doing that in Dallas for a good chunk of the week after the one that is about to come. So next week I will probably be coming to you from, well, there'll definitely be somewhere in the US, Not quite sure how my schedule will go with events. But anyway, so I'll be over there next week. Now, moving on to like two massive stories over the last week and a bit, really. And we'll do this in reverse chronological order. So I got up this morning and the internet was on fire again because of this Supermicro situation. And this is one of these things where I honestly don't feel like I have a lot of insightful information to contribute, other than to say that if you haven't seen the headlines already, basically the story is that Supermicro creates motherboards and other PC and server components. They get their bits and pieces from China. China's been allegedly inserting these tiny processors, like literally the size of the tip of a pencil, into the machines to give them some sort of remote access and control into large organizations, including the likes of Amazon and Apple. And Bloomberg has done this very large write-up on it. It's massive front page news at the moment. And allegedly they've been working on this for a very long time. I think it was around about a year. I'm doing a lot of allegedlys here. Allegedly a lot of sources within Amazon and Apple contributing to this too. And of course, Amazon and Apple have come out with rebuttals already. Chinese government has come out with rebuttals as well. And the truth is, I've got absolutely no idea who's right. What we often see when these things blow up is there will be extreme ends of each argument. You know, the press wants to make this look as bad as possible. And of course, the press is a bit of an echo chamber. So other organizations have jumped on this and echoed the same thing. I was just doing a search just before I recorded this and looking at my... all I did is search for Bloomberg. And there's a lot of stuff here. Everything from the ABC here in Australia, Aussie Broadcasting Company, CNBC, it's over there. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff on YouTube and different pieces. There's a lot of press that's picked up on this and is echoing the Bloomberg report. On the flip side, we've got Amazon and who's the other one? Amazon and Apple rebutting a bunch of it and saying that they've told Bloomberg multiple times on interviews over the previous sort of months that a lot of this is not true. It is just very, very hard to tell because particularly in this sort of circumstance, a lot of this plays into national security as well. So maybe there are certain things that have happened, but the likes of Amazon and Apple can't confirm it because there are national security implications. Maybe also the press sometimes like to blow stuff up a little bit. I honestly don't know, but I do think it creates really, really interesting, I guess, food for thought more than anything else. You know, when you think about things like supply chains and where we get our chips and components and things from and how much confidence we have over the integrity of it, and also that the principle of could we make processors and microchips that are small enough that are virtually undetectable. I think one of the pieces I read said, look, they basically look like tiny capacitors, but they're actually microprocessors, which is, you know, really a very interesting thought. So look, I think this has a long way to play out yet. It'll be really interesting if Apple and Amazon are adamant enough about the incorrectness of the Bloomberg piece, if they take any sort of legal action or if they get any sort of nastiness about the way they sort of deal with it. And we'll see how it all washes up. And in the meantime, we'll just have lots of people go off on conspiracy theories and lots of echo chambering press. So that wasn't really adding much of substance. But I honestly don't think we're at a point now where we have a lot of independently verifiable substance. Moving on to the other big thing though, and this had happened before my update last week, or was it on the day? Anyway, it's the Facebook thing. So Facebook claiming a total of around about 90 million people effectively have what seems to be a bit of a case of session hijacking, where auth tokens have been exposed via a flaw in the View As feature. Now, I don't want to sort of go back and recap the mechanics of that. Facebook says there are sort of several different flaws and they chain together and they created the problem that we have here today. I was more interested in a couple of the ancillary things around that. And I made a few notes because I wanted to sort of capture them here. And one of the notes was I put out a tweet and I said, look, or to scroll back a second, one of the alleged problems here is that if we leak auth tokens and effectively you can session hijack, then could you use that authenticated Facebook session to authenticate to other services where people had signed up with Facebook? So you know how you can like go to a totally non-Facebook related site and log in with Facebook? So the proposition that was put forward was people said this would potentially put those other accounts at risk. Now Facebook has subsequently said they have no evidence of that having had happened, although I think the choice of word, no evidence of it happening, as opposed to undeniable proof that it didn't happen is maybe there's an important nuance there. Regardless, I put out a tweet and I made the point that this is one of the key reasons why whenever I sign up to another service, I don't use Facebook or Google or Twitter. If the account gives me the option or the service gives me the option, I create a new account with my password manager. So I use my password manager to have unique accounts for everything. And I effectively said, look, there's sandboxing. So I can have, say a dozen different independent services where I could have signed up with Facebook, but instead I used unique usernames and passwords. And my position on this is that this isolates me against risks such as the ones we just saw, let alone also isolating me against some of the tracking, etc., that Facebook does. And I put that out, and it got a lot of traction. I think it's one of my most popular tweets in the last 4 weeks, according to Twitter Analytics. One of the pieces of feedback that often came back, though, half a dozen people maybe, is they said, well, now you're just moving the risks to the password manager. And they were somehow trying to imply that by using a password manager to store information that you have to sign into multiple locations was the same as using a social media platform to sign into multiple places. And it's not. They're like totally different things for several key reasons. One of them, as someone else pointed out, is I said, look, a password manager, let's say it's 1Password. 1Password is there just to be a password manager. Like, this is the only thing it does. The entire purpose of it is to look after your passwords. And they have clients for different devices. And they never have your master password. They never have unencrypted passwords. They do all of these things really extensively around supporting the security and the integrity of your passwords. The other thing, sells ads. Right? So Facebook's reason for being is to sell ads. Twitter and Google and all the other authentication providers you can sign in with, they have entirely different business models to protecting your passwords. Now, that's a bit of a broad motherhood statement. So what does that actually look like? Well, for example, things like signing into 1Password is a very, very tightly managed, very secure process. It is not like just whack your username and password in and you're good to go. There's a whole bunch of information they never have about me. I mean, one of the things that's very different is we never have long-running sessions as well. So, Facebook, it's like you sign in today, you go on holidays for a couple of weeks, come back, still signed in. That's the nature of it by default. And this, of course, is the way most people use it because they're in and out of social media platforms the whole time. Password managers, you walk away from your computer for 10 minutes and it locks you out of the entire password manager, whether it's using the website-based version, which you don't normally use, so you don't have most of the browser-based bugs, which you get in other things. Or if it's the Rich Client app, well, then it will log you out and you're going to need your master password or your face or whatever you're using to authenticate. So it's a very, very different proposition in many, many ways. And I think people are sort of missing how fundamentally disparate a social media platform is to a password manager when they say it's the same sort of thing. Now, look at my notes again as well. One of the other themes that came up was something that we've seen many times before, such as after Cambridge Analytica, where people go, you should delete Facebook. If you care about your security, you should delete Facebook. And, some people are saying, look, I'm happier now that I have deleted Facebook. I saw other people lamenting deleting Facebook. They wanted to, but they didn't want to lose the photos of their children, which they'd shared with their friends and things like this a decade ago. And for a bit of context, and I do recall actually Scott Helm and I spoke about this together on one of these updates a while ago, I have absolutely no intention whatsoever of deleting Facebook. I like to see what my friends around the world are doing. I like to use it to socialize with people. I like to share photos of my kids as they grow up so our friends and family in different parts of the world can see what we're up to. It provides a very good service around that. And regardless of what you think of Facebook's ethics or their business model, there's no denying that they've got a couple of billion people on the platform. And if you want to share things socially, that has the greatest reach. Now, I hear it's different. It's going to sound old now, but I hear it's different for kids these days. And they're less interested in the likes of Facebook. But certainly for us and our family and things like cousins overseas, like this is the way we like to try and share things. So I have no intention of deleting Facebook, but I'm sensible about how I use it as well. So to the point I just mentioned before, I'm not going to use Facebook to sign into everything else. I'm only going to put things on Facebook that won't cause me damage if they're exposed publicly. you know, like there's photos of my family and things on there, but nothing that's going to cause them embarrassment if ever it goes public. Nothing that's going to cause me embarrassment or make my career prospects damaged or anything like that. And I guess the point I'm making here is if you're concerned about privacy, there is a way to use these services in such a way that it's not going to have any tangible detrimental impact on you. I think that the delete Facebook thing, for the most part, is a very emotive reaction, which is usually incommensurate to the actual risk that incidents like this really present. So that's Facebook. Oh, here's a fun one. I forgot I put this in. Komodo. Now, I've gotten in trouble before for saying Komodo because people have picked me up and said it's not Komodo, it's Komodo CA. Komodo CA is a very different thing to Komodo. Komodo CA is the company that Komodo span off just to do the CA bit, which still starts with the word Komodo. And I haven't checked, but I'm going to take a stab at this and guess that it's a lot of the same people actually behind it in terms of who owns and controls companies. I don't know, maybe it's slightly different, but the point is that they're all from the same thing. You know what I mean? When I say Komodo and we're talking about certificates, it's Komodo CA. Be that as it may, Komodo runs a certificate transparency service, which is at crt.sh. And they unfortunately had their certificate expire the other day. And it got quite a bit of discussion on the Twitters. And the thing about it, there's really multiple things. So, you know, number one, certificate expiration does happen quite a lot. Unintended. I'm going to choose different words. It's not even unintended. Like, you know when your certificate is going to expire. The problem was not the expiration. The problem was not having a new one in place before the old one expired. So this premise of not being able to control that life cycle and get in front of the expiration is something that does happen quite a bit. Microsoft did it only a few weeks ago. The thing happens. So this is not entirely unusual. One of the ways we have of dealing with this is automated renewals. It's one of the things that Let's Encrypt does so well via their Acme implementation. It's also one of the things Cloudflare does so well because they just renew it for you and you never hold the keys anyway. Point is that something that needs to happen repetitively and is important should be automated. Wasn't in this case. Part of the reason it wasn't is it's an extended validation certificate. There is still manual labor involved in renewing the certificate because you need to go through verification processes. The thing that's really kind of funny here is that they could have fixed this in minutes by going and just putting a DV certificate on there. Domain validated certificate. Prove you control the domain. Not necessarily from Let's Encrypt. Komodo CA can obviously issue their own DV certificates. But apparently, and I'm not going to name the individual who said this because I don't know whether it's a public tweet, but I don't know whether they really want to be proverbially thrown under the bus. Apparently, Komodo CA has a policy to use EV certs on all its web properties. So because they had a policy to use EV certs, they couldn't use a DV cert, which would have got them back up and running. So the policy, which is there to assumably do the things that Komodo tries to sell EV certs on, you know, increase user trust and everything, is the thing which then caused them to have a site which would have thrown massive errors in any browser because the certificate was expired. There is a certain irony there. What can I actually repeat from this? EV validation for the replacement cert is taking longer than they have anticipated. So look, EV validation takes effort. Like, we know this. It just boggles my mind that Komodo is sort of like sticking with this thing of we should just keep EV because reasons, even if it means the whole site is down. So, but then again, they were really backed into a difficult corner, I guess. I mean, it's hard not to laugh, right? You know, like they're trying to sell the EV thing and go, EV is so important. By the way, our site is down because of our insistence on using EV. Anyway. And then someone will probably argue and go, well, it's not down because of EV. It's down because they let it expire. Yeah, but if you got a DV, you could have just got it bang straight back up. Problem solved. Anyway, EV certificates. Fun there. Oh, you know what? Last week I went and checked to see if PayPal had managed to fix the visual indicator of the EV certificate because they had a cert chain that somehow didn't have the right OID or something like that in Windows. I haven't checked PayPal again. Is PayPal showing a visible EV certificate now, or are we having the visual indicator of a DV? Let's have a look. My laughter indicates the answer. Go and check for yourself. All right, let's move on. Pluralsight. So I mentioned a new course and I'm wearing all the Pluralsight things. So I've been doing this quarterly series with Pluralsight since the start of the year around creating a security-centric culture. And the whole point of doing this was in response to organizations when we had a bunch of customer meetings saying all the hard skills and stuff are great. And what we mean by hard skills is like, here's the mechanics of SQL injection, and here's how XSS works, etc. And here's how to parameterize statements and output encode your things. That's great. There's copious amounts of information about that on Pluralsight. No problems there. But the organizations we're speaking to are saying, we want to actually ingrain within the culture behaviors which are more conducive to adopting security as a first-class citizen of the life cycle of us building software and creating products. So, really, how do we get everyone just thinking about this the whole time and it being part of the normal way of we go about business, as opposed to being sort of a hard skill that you sit down and implement? So we decided to do this Creating a Security-Centric Culture series. And we decided to do it every quarter. And best of all, we decided to put it in front of the paywall. So if you don't pay Pluralsight any money for subscriptions, that's fine. You can still go and watch it totally for free. So we did the first two. This is the third one in the series this year. And this is about embracing a security culture of continual change. And I was really passionate about this one because this is one where we start to talk about how rapidly this industry changes and how if you are not staying abreast of the changes, you fall behind very quickly with thinking that is often 180 degrees reversed from the new normal. And I'll give you some examples of what's in here. I'm actually doing this like after lunch, a little bit later today. And I think it's just kind of screwed with my head. Anyway, so one of the things we're trying to do is sort of talk about what's new. And this is all, it's just like this. It's like me in front of the camera, but without a baseball cap and wearing a shirt. But me in front of the camera talking and some screencast material as well. And some of the things we talk about are things like changing visual indicators in browsers. Now, incidentally, this was actually recorded just before Chrome 69 hit, where we took away the secure text and we took away the green padlock and we took away the green HTTPS. And a great example, which of course is not in that video because it hasn't happened yet, is you can't tell people to look for the green secure text because it doesn't exist anymore. Examples which were in there were things like you can't tell people that if there's a padlock, the site is safe, because this is not the case anymore. This is what Barclays Bank got pinged for earlier this year because they were saying, hey, look for the padlock. If you see a padlock, you know the site is safe. And this is really interesting because that is completely different logic to what we used. Let's go back, say, 3 years ago. So 3 years ago, if you saw the padlock, pretty solid it was going to be a legit site because you really weren't getting free certificates. There is an exception. We were getting some free certificates, but it wasn't like let's encrypt free for all sort of stuff. So back then it was a very, very different value proposition. Passwords is another great example. So I mentioned just before things like complexity rules. You go back a few years ago and the whole logic of password was mathematical complexity, uppercase, lowercase. In order to fool the hackers, you should do some character substitution and replace some letters with some numbers. And now we've gone, no, that's crap. Like that doesn't work. And now we say, okay, we should be using like passphrases and things like that. Another great one related to passwords is we used to say you should rotate your passwords every 3 months in case the hacker gets it. And now, of course, we're saying, and like literally the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK is saying things like only force people to change passwords on suspicion of compromise. Don't implement or enforce password rotation rules because that's going to force people into bad habits because they're just going to keep incrementing the number at the end of the password. So this is what I really like about this course. It takes stuff and it turns it on its head. And as I say in the intro to this, so my first sentence here on the blog post I wrote about this, I said, I take more pleasure than I probably should in watching the bewilderment within organizations as the technology landscape rapidly changes and rushes ahead of them. And I think back to my days in corporate life in particular, where you had people in technology roles who really were not on top of things. And I would watch the bewilderment on their faces as new things would come down the pipeline and they would have absolutely no idea about why they were there. I remember when things like Git started getting a lot of traction. And people were like, why on earth would you have this? I thought source control was always subversion on a central server somewhere. And, like just very, very old ways of thinking that we're having trouble adapting to a very rapidly changing environment. And as I say in this blog post, if anyone is in a technology role and they think that a huge amount of what they do now is not going to be very different in the very near future, then they're just not paying attention. And the whole point of this, and the whole point around the culture aspect of this, is that you have to embrace this change. You have to recognize that it is going to keep changing. And if you're not staying on top of it, the beliefs that you hold today around how technology works or security works are possibly going to be 180 degrees different in only a few years, because it is a changing landscape and things move on. So that's the Pluralsight course. That is now out live. That is a free-for-all, so please go and enjoy that. I hope people get a lot of use out of it. I have a meeting literally next week to start planning the final one for this year in the series. If you have an idea about what that should be, let me know, because if I'm honest, I've really not thought about it yet. But if you can think about what would be a really great thing to cover in terms of what organizations should do within a security culture, I would love to hear about that. So last thing this week's sponsor is DigiCert. This week, DigiCert is talking about quantum computing, spelling the end of RSA and elliptic curve cryptography, which is actually kind of interesting, because as we start to get more traction around quantum, there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff which maybe doesn't quite work as efficiently as what it did before, at least in terms of protections. So obviously DigiCert is a CA. They're one of the CAs who, as I've said before, certainly has been lifting their game a lot more than many of the other CAs, some of which I may have mentioned earlier in this talk. And I appreciate that they're actually trying to do a bunch of things beyond just that certificate side of things too. So go and check them out. First, thank you for DigiCert for their coverage this week. And that is it for this week's update. So as I mentioned, I'll be off to the US. I should be in the US exactly 1 week from now. And I will try and get you a video from Texas, and I'll still be there the Friday. In fact, I'll be flying out the Friday night afterwards. But that'll be local time, which will be in the past, so maybe I can do the future. Incidentally, when you fly back from America, you actually, like one day disappears. Like you leave on a Friday night, and then you land here on a Sunday morning, which is always fun. So I have jet lag and all the rest of it coming up to deal with. Anyway, thank you very much for watching today, and I will come to you from the US next week. See you guys.